So this paper has several co-authors, and these are people all working on this ARC discovery project. So again, Alex Crook, who's been the postdoc on the project, Trisna, and Bill Thompson, William Ford Thompson, who originally got the grant with me. So we were the two principal CIs. In this presentation, what I'm going to do is explore what intercultural music understanding can be. And then I'm going to talk about a study we devised to understand how that might function. And we're going to appraise the findings in terms of a previous theoretical model that the team developed. And perhaps we won't have time to explore ideas for future study, but that's maybe something that will come up in the discussion because it's also very important. Essentially, it's really important, particularly given where we're sitting today in early November 2023 with so much intercultural conflict in the world, to have some kind of collective social glue. And what we need to be able to do is recognize and appreciate cultural differences and similarities. And we really need to be able to talk with understanding and behave with understanding with a diverse range of people in really respectful and inclusive ways. And sort of theoretically, the kind of nub of this is John Berry, who was a really important figure in intercultural psychology, could be regarded as the founding father of the discipline, posited the idea that intercultural interactions require individuals to have the cognitive ability. So it's not only good enough just to present these options, you have to be able to understand and appreciate cultural difference and behavioural skills to really navigate and interact in these cross-cultural situations. So without that cognitive preparation, if you like, things are not going to change, or that capacity is not going to be there. So let's just look briefly at music and the arts more broadly. I think we'll all be aware, sort of out there in the popular ether, there are examples of music in particular being valuable in fostering intercultural understanding. But these kinds of positive things we talk about are not absolute guarantees. And for all the cases that one might make or we hear of in the press, there will be a counterexample. So what we're trying to get at is this kind of work really requires perhaps a much more nuanced understanding of both culture and contextual factors, and a way to work through that with music, not just say, oh, let's slap on a bit of music, let's do a mass pop concert and bring people from different places in the world. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Our theoretical framework has recently been published, and in that we propose some ideas that we believe will work. Now, they're coming from theoretical propositions, and some look at previous literature. And the kinds of things we're talking about is we say that actually, if you take a nuanced view of this, music reflects both things that are happening at a universal level, but they also speak to diversity. It's that last point Trisna made, in fact, yes? So music has to be able to speak to the cultural specificity, but it also can embrace something much more general as well. And not only that, that in our approach to these interactions, we have to behave with cultural safety for the people who are being engaged in the activity, and a kind of humility. We can't be patronizing, we can't take a higher stance, we have to behave with humility towards another cultural practice. And again, Trisna spoke in the previous review about the importance of embodied experience and understanding very much from that experiential point of view. And again, that was something that came up in our literature and in the theoretical ideas. And so that suggests that one needs to work within a cultural ecology. One needs to understand the culture and the practices. One can't assume that one is ever going to know in depth those practices, and therefore one has to interact with that culture if it's different to your own, with a kind of cultural humility. And the other thing is that music and power and positionality and all those things I've just alluded to in terms of cultural practice are really interconnected, and those factors need to be managed or carefully worked through. And so those ideas were well received, and we have published that paper. However, we felt that was really a lack of empirical evidence to either support or thwart our propositions. So we had a theoretical question, a research question: how useful is intercultural music engagement framework for describing the needs and experiences of intercultural music practitioners? So we honed in on practitioners across a range of various settings. And so what we did was we did very in-depth work that involved interviews, but also observations. We had 15 participants from different locations in the world, the majority from Australia, because that's where we're based, but there were also representatives from Norway and the United States. But as you can see, the people that we engaged with actually had a range of cultural backgrounds themselves. Although they might have been living in a particular country, their cultural identity and often heritage was slightly different. So often people coming from migrant backgrounds shifted, transplanted into another context. And you can see the range of different cultures, nationalities represented. What I'm going to do is begin by going through the a priori themes and saying, well, by and large, we did find evidence to support them. I'm not going to give a million examples, even though we probably have them. I'm just going to give one or two of each. Otherwise, we'll be here all afternoon. So what about this reflection of universality and difference? Well, I've got quite a nice example here, which is when you talk about the elements of music. So Sarita, who is of Indian heritage living in Australia, was one of our very eloquent respondents. And she was talking about the harmonic structure behind scales. And she says, well, look, these are different in different cultures. But what you can do is you can find points of alignment. So when we were watching her, we could find chords and scales that she was testing on her sitar, and she was trying to work out how they aligned harmonically with analogous chords and scales played on a Greek bouzouki. So not the same instrument, both stringed instruments, different cultural heritages, but nonetheless she was looking to find meeting points. And so this was a lived example of how two cultures, two different sets of musics, could come together in a harmonious conversation through the music. So that's at the musical level. And then the other thing was to look at historical lineage. So this is one of the respondents talking, this is Daniel talking about this. He says, we recorded an album, and there's this one tune that comes from Transylvania. And I started researching about the style, and I came to information that that particular style you can also find not only in Transylvania, but Poland, Sweden, Norway, and Romania. So quite a broad geographical spread. They sound a little bit different, but the root of this type of song is the same. For me, it was a shock to see that. In my head, the Balkans and Norway don't have anything in common, but apparently there are some things that are similar. So this is this kind of searching out, finding, could be found by chance, but this is something that Daniel is identifying where we have universality and difference. Here is the other one that I mentioned as I was introducing the project, which is this concept of cultural humility and safety. And that's over this theoretical idea of you can become culturally competent in another person's lived experience and culture. And as time is progressing and we're developing depth of understanding, we realize that there are actually limitations on that. So we've chosen to look at these approaches to music from another culture as humility. So this is to help people understand and appreciate or feel the music, while also learning or understanding a little bit more about the other person's culture. That doesn't mean to say that you have to be competent in another cultural style. You can't appropriate a culture that is not yours. And there are challenges to this. So for instance, I mean, again, when we were watching what unfold in the lives of these musicians, again, I'm drawing on Sarita. She attended a multicultural event, an alleged multicultural event, and she wore her traditional cultural clothes. She wore her sari, she brought her very best, largest sitar, but she was actually pushed at the back of the room. And we got the strong sense that she was being used as a tokenistic representation of what multiculturalism could be, and that the other band that were being forefronted were not of a migrant cultural background. So she was kind of being used to offer some exotic backdrop. So these are the kinds of things that we want to draw attention to. And then again, cross-referring to what Trisna was mentioning, so embodied experiential immersion seems really important to all these interviewees, and that was consistent with our observations. So immersive, immediate, and sensory experiences were deeply affecting for people. They were working in a shared space, and it also offered a very powerful connection between people sitting at different cultural points of view. And Neil was an Indigenous Australian, and he talked about this in terms of the value of embodiment, also meaning being embedded in a landscape, being on country, feeling part of something. And Faisal also talked about that. He talked about feeling the whole ambience of being there and the powerful force of being in a face-to-face live music making context. So then let's push on and talk about the cultural ecology of that, and note that Andy, who is the co-CEO of Multicultural Arts Victoria, mentioned that he felt that historically, although they were representing a broad spectrum of migrant and ethnically diverse communities in Victoria, if not the whole of Australia, migrant groups really politically and over time had not been given a fair bite at the cherry. And what he meant by that was people representing themselves and not being brokered by other people. And again, to quote Sarita, I think every individual culture or every individual person has to maintain their culture, where they come from. But there's a time you're going, you're meeting, you're evolving, you're mixing up with another musician, and you want to mix some of their elements into your playing. It's like making and cooking food, you know. So it's like spicing things up, changing things, gradually letting them marinate and change over time. And Buba also adds, music has to grow. It can't be absolutely static. Now, in some cultural contexts, it's very important to keep things pure and historically very precise. But in these kinds of intercultural engagements, we see that there's some fluidity and flexibility there. So music and power are interconnected. The work's demanding, and people need to respect that. And again, Sarita says, and we're underpaid. So she's making a very strong political point here. Musicians always get underpaid. And unless you're in a job or somewhere where you can go, okay, that's taking care of a bit, But as an independent artist, we often have to struggle all the time. And sometimes we have to put our foot down. And she actually talked about sometimes turning up and people saying, well, you do the job, and then it taking months or maybe not even being paid. And then just to rush on to talk about cultural infiltration, a concept related to that, Buba said, yeah, that's the beautiful work in our job as a musician and as an entertainer, because sometimes the music sends us behind camps. We can go into other territories where there's somewhere that you know that's not your zone, but you will be stuck here. So what you can do is get a lot of messages through, and then you're going to be okay. So he's very comfortable to sit in that space and work through to make his voice clear, and also perhaps adapt a little bit. So here we are, we're left with this prototype, this theoretical prototype. And what we can see is at the top level, music is a shared human activity. It's also an expression of that rich diversity of human kind. And intercultural music engagement can occur if these conditions are met. The musical engagement's embodied, it's experiential, it adopts a stance of cultural humility, it prioritizes cultural safety, it's informed by context, and also acknowledges that there are power dynamics and addresses that in some way. That might be to relax about it and work through, or it might be to confront. And of course, the risks of working in this space, as our respondents were only too experienced in having felt these things themselves, was the tokenism that can occur, like turning up at an event and being the exotic, a kind of cultural appropriation where people say that they can take on the mantle of what you're doing and do it as well as you, and that kind of cultural othering that can also occur. And that sort of represents a kind of symbolic violence. It's kind of subtle, it's not physical violence, but it's a kind of intrusion and incursion into somebody's sense, or even more broadly, a cultural group's sense of who they are. The potential benefits, however, as we have seen through our case study examples and is represented in the literature Trisna talked about, is that it does indeed afford the opportunities for social cohesion, cultural affirmation, intercultural understanding, and empathy. So we feel that this is important work that we've been doing. We're going to continue. The story is a little bit more complex than just that, but they're the thoughts and ideas I wanted to share with you today. And here we have some of the references that are relevant to the paper. So thank you very much.